And welcome to Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres, episode 67. Tonight is the texture challenge. Last week I talked about the notion of texture in photography. Is there a way of photographing something such that the viewer can almost feel it through the image? So that was the challenge. I talked about different notions of texture, about how a lot of texture is based on memories of what we expect something to sort of feel like. But it can also be profoundly affected by things like the light and the angle at which the light comes, and also kind of how close in we get. So I put that out as the challenge. We've had about 20 odd people respond to it, which has been great. And we're going to take a look through the photos this evening, see what people have put in, have a little bit of a chat about some of the images, and hopefully at the end of it feel a little bit more inspired. So that next time you're going for one of those online competitions which says texture as its key thing, you'll have a better idea of either what to raid from your archives or what kind of things you can be doing when you go out and take the photo. So here we are, live on Facebook. Please leave me a comment, say hello, let me know where you're from. And if you're not watching live, if you're watching this on YouTube afterwards, because I record all these and usually the following day by Wednesday afternoon-ish, depending on which part of the world you're in, these are up on YouTube. If you go to youtube.com/Kim Ayres, you will find everything, all the previous episodes there, all previous 66. In fact, actually earlier this week, I was practicing on YouTube just to see, is it as straightforward to do these podcasts straight onto YouTube as it is straight onto Facebook? And it seems to be. Now, I haven't worked out quite how I can do it simultaneously to both, but it does leave the option for at some point in the future, if required, that we could in fact do these on YouTube. If you think it would be an awful lot easier to watch these on YouTube than on Facebook, let me know, and I'll kind of get a sense of whether that's likely to happen. Not going to happen in the immediate future. We are still here on Facebook every Tuesday, 7:30 p.m. UK time. If you find these podcasts useful, interesting, entertaining, and you would like to support them, then buymeacoffee.com/Kim Ayres is the place to do it. It's not compulsory, but it is always appreciated. Right, so with that in mind, I see there's comments, I have followers, I have people coming in. And I have Facebook telling me that the frame rate per second is way too low, and I've got no idea why that is. It's been doing this. The last 2 or 3 weeks, Facebook keeps telling me that there's something wrong with it. It doesn't seem to matter what settings I change. It tells me it's too low, it's too high. Anyway, my apologies if my frame rate is too low, in which case I presume I probably appear a bit kind of jumpy and whatever. Anyway, let's take a look. We've got some comments. We've got people watching. This is brilliant. So Maggie says, good evening, everyone. Ben says, hello, people. Rosie says, hello, Kim and everyone. Jim is saying, hi, Kim and everyone watching from a bright Dumfries. Yeah, and we're in Dumfries and Galloway. The sun's out. Rather lovely. John Harvey from Ohio says, hello, all. Brian says, hi, Kim, and all who are watching. Will be good to get your comments tonight. And there is a good number of images sent in. Yeah, like I say, roughly about sort of 20 odd images to look through. Sandra says, hello, everyone, from a sunny Birmingham. Jackie says, hello there from an icy South Africa. Don't tend to think about South Africa as being icy, but then, of course, it's the middle of winter there. We have Southern Hemisphere watching in. Kazia says, good evening, all. Roy says, good evening, all. Mandy says, good evening, everyone. Megan says, hello from Montana. So glad you could make it along to the live one, Megan. We also have Robert saying, howdy from America, and Robert's based in Texas. Naria says, hello, everyone. Shashi says, hello. VG says, good evening, everyone. And Vandana says, hi, all. So this is great. We've got a good few people in watching this evening. So, like I say, we're going to be talking about texture and working through the different images that people have sent in, and we're going to comment. I will keep checking in on the comments after each picture that I've looked at. So if there's anything you would like to add or ask about, then please do. And we'll work our way through it. Oh, Gary's come in also, says hello from the Peak District. Cool. This is really good. got a great turnout. So what I'm going to start with then, let's excuse me, let's just start working our way through it. So like I say, if anybody didn't catch the one last week, you can either scroll back through the Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres Facebook page until you find it, or go to youtube.com and look at last week's one where I talk much more in depth about texture. So whereas tonight we're going to see what people have put in. Right, okay, so first image I want to talk about, I suppose then, is going to be this one from April. Now, April sent this one in, and she said, this sleeping bee is for the texture challenge. I was at a local botanical garden late morning, and it was just soaking up the sun. I feel like petting the yellow hair. How about you? Well, I have to say I would certainly think twice before attempting to pet a bee as such. But I do know what you mean. There's something lovely about that kind of hair. It's almost fur, isn't it? You can kind of feel there's a lovely texture within that. You know, it's certainly, I mean, unfortunately, this is just a sort of Facebook level image that you've sent in. I would imagine in a higher definition it would be even more interesting. But you've got that fur. But it contrasts rather beautifully with the soft petals of the rose as well, and you can almost, I've got a love for roses, and I can always smell the scent of the rose there. And I think as textures go, it's a really nice combination to have that bee, have that flower. And I think also the fact that you've got this with a relatively wide aperture, so it's a nice kind of soft background as well, that helps to sort of emphasize the texture on the bee while at the same time also helping with the softness of the rose as well. So I think actually, yeah, smug points. Let's throw in a few smug points. So I think you deserve a smug point for this one, April. Lovely start to the evening. Thanks very much for sending this one in. Cool. Okay, so where are we at? A couple of comments come in. Vandana says she loves the yellow hair. Nuria says very fluffy, loves it. April saying thank you. Jim loves the furry bee. Gary's asking whether you were using a macro lens or extension tubes. So yeah, okay, April, if you can remember what it is, how you took the photo, if you want to just sort of drop into the texture, drop into the comments, whether there was a particular lens you were using, or whether you were using your phone, or whether you know how you managed to get in quite so close, or whether it was just further out and you cropped in. Jackie says, I didn't know the bees were so fluffy before. Well, I think a lot with bees, there's an awful lot of hair. It really does kind of depend on how close in you get. Certainly they're more furry, or certainly some of the bees, the bumblebees particularly. But I can't remember how many different species of bee there are. It's quite a lot, that's for sure. They're not all honeybees. Right, okay, so let's move on then. Let's flip on to the next image. The next one we have is from Ben Craven, who says, I was rather taken with this sea-etched piece of driftwood, with its surface made glossy by water but gritty by sand. It's a bit tight on the right, but there's no more photo there. The moral is... And of course what Ben's referring to here is a very common phrase of mine, which is give it room to breathe. However, having said that, my feeling with this, Ben, is I'd almost want to go closer in. First of all, what I would say is I do like this. That notion of when you're down at the seaside and you have that little bit of wet driftwood, and as you say, kind of ingrained with sand, you can see the sea, you can see the seaweed. There's a lot of texture in this, and certainly I get that sense of feeling it. You know, how many times, you know, as a child or even as an adult, you know, you see an interesting piece of wet sea driftwood and you pick it up and you can feel the moisture, and you say the sort of bit of gritty sand and the dampness and the hardness of the wood. You've got the sound of the sea either crashing or maybe just rippling in the background. And so it really does, I think a photo like this really does evoke the other senses, which is primarily what we were talking about. What we're trying to do with the texture is to kind of go, what would that feel like? Can I sort of look at this and get a sense of it? And I think you can with this. But like I say, really, I'm kind of more tempted. I think it would have been quite nice. Maybe get a little bit lower and still, because I do like that bit of sea in the background, but I think you could kind of, if it was possible, you know, where you sort of get in close and you really then would start seeing the ridges and the full kind of texture of the wood. Maybe, depending on where the water was running up to, a little bit of seaweed in it or something perhaps. I do quite like some of this seaweed, especially over here. It's sharp just in one place, it goes out of focus quite quickly. Given that this was bright sunshine, then I think you could probably have gone for a narrower depth of field, maybe something like an F11, even an F13, and you would have still had enough light to have quite a high shutter speed, and then you would have got more of it in focus, which I think would have helped bring out that sense of texture, not just of the wood, but of the sand and maybe the seaweed behind it as well. But no, yeah, that one certainly evokes, so I think smug points to you too there, Ben. Right, okay. Let's see what else have we got any. Oh, April says she was using an Olympus Tough microscope mode. Microscope mode, wow, okay, I didn't even know those things existed. Okay, so that's fun. So if you've got a camera which has a microscope mode, that's the way to get in close. Brilliant. Thanks for that, April. Rosie says, lovely bee. Now, John says, I like these natural still lifes. Good shot. VG says, loves the driftwood in close quarters. And, right, okay. Little bits of comments going back between VG and April, I think. And Ben says, thanks, Kim. Very helpful and interesting. Well, that's good to know. I'm glad that's useful. Sandra says, nice texture in the wood too. Right, okay. So next up then, Benedito. And where we go? Let's flip over to this one. So Benedito says, taken last Tuesday evening when I should have been watching Kim. Yes, if you're going to take your photos, don't do it on a Tuesday evening. You should be here watching the podcast live. But I love the rough seas. The back end of a storm usually gets the best waves. Anyway, here's a breach in the old seawall at Climping Beach, West Sussex. I guess it should be called roughness. Rough sea, rough concrete, rough beach. So, Benedito here then has gone for several textures all in one go. So we've got the roughness of the sea wall, this kind of the very stoned concrete. We've got the pebbles on the beach. Got this rather lovely kind of wood, whether it's part of a shipwreck or an old breakwater, I'm not entirely sure. But they're all those poles sitting up, maybe part of a jetty, and this kind of rough sea going on. I think for my money though, it feels a little bit overcooked really with the editing. It has to be said. The colours seem the blue in the sky. I'm assuming you've painted on afterwards, Benedito. You kind of added it in because if I'm down here at this level, this kind of sky looks more natural. But as we get kind of further up, this kind of really does look quite unnatural. I think also the colouring, it's a bit like you kind of took the vibrant slider and whacked it over to the right a little bit. And the colours just don't quite sit there. I also think there's kind of a problem here where there's too much sharpening. Because all the textures are very textured, that it kind of feels a bit over sharpened. But I can see why you were drawn to this. And I feel that sky, although I know it's classic rule of thirds, I don't know that it's really adding that much to the story. I think the real story with here, or at least the thing that grabs my attention anyway, are these bits of wood here. And for that, I think coming in closer works better. And then maybe if you're using a little bit of this breach in the sea wall, which is what you've done here to frame it, but I think if you sort of come in more like that, something like this, and actually if your rule of thirds horizon, rather than using it as a horizon for the sky, actually almost use it where the sea comes in. And I think something like this, we then end up with a nice sort of shaped diagonals coming down from the left. You're framing the wooden posts, which I think are where the real interest is in this. And then the sea becomes the background. And I don't think you really need the sky in that. So anyway, that will be my recommendation with this, Benedito. Great place to spot it though, to find the break in the sea wall with the wooden bits behind. So thanks for sending that one in. Great. And Gary says dehaze in Lightroom can also produce that saturated look. Okay, yeah, I must admit I don't tend to use Lightroom. I know a lot of people do. It's just I use Photoshop for pretty much everything I do. I think if you are one of these who is doing, I think Lightroom really comes into its own if you are doing a lot of photos from sort of one shoot. You know, like if you're doing wedding photography or something like that, it's really wonderful, where essentially you might have particular settings on your camera and you shot a lot of photos like that, and so you're going to make the same adjustments to sort of batch photography. I think it kind of really comes into its own. Most of my photography tends to be one-off singular pieces, or maybe no more than 2 or 3. I suppose I've just got the hang of Photoshop. But yes, I think it's I'm not sure, and I've tried the dehaze so much in Photoshop to see whether it saturates the colours, but it's worth remembering that. So thanks for pointing that one out, Gary. What have we got here? Jackie likes the crop. I think the idea of zooming in. Roy says they're called groins, Kim. Oh, is that the posts in the water? Okay, cool. So I'll go a little bit further then, because I don't have. If I go off and Google this, Roy, then I'm going to be taking away from the podcast. Tell me a little bit more. What was the purpose of these groins? Groynes, Roy said. Tell me a little bit more about the purpose of these groins. Are they sort of part from a jetty or something that went out, or were they put there to like a breakwater? So anyway, drop that one into the comments when you've got a moment. That'd be great. Jim says he likes it cropped in as well, as does VG, thinks cutting out the sky is a good idea. So does Sandra. Cool. Okay. So next image then. Let's not that one. Let's flip over to here. We have Brian, and Brian says, I took this picture at Kirkconnell Flow on Wednesday night. I like the textures of the tree bark parting company with the tree. Okay, so trees and tree bark, wonderful place to go and get texture. It's very rare you ever find a tree that's completely smooth. There is a couple of things with this though that strike me, Brian. Primarily, I think part of it is trying to get to what's the story, because what you say in your writing is you like the textures of the tree bark parting company with the tree, and for that's yeah, absolutely. If we sort of see here, it's that way. They sort of kind of almost push out, like sort of, or you see it around the edges around here like this. It's always like kind of folded paper, and it's sort of stretching out, and there's nothing even and smooth with it. It's very, very layered, and yeah, I absolutely think that's really interesting. That's lovely texture. Where I think the problem with this lies primarily is you've got this great big circle in the middle, although it's not exactly in the middle. It's slightly off middle. It's not, but it doesn't feel to me like it's off-centre enough to feel like it's off-centre, nor is it central enough to feel like it's meant to be smack bang in the middle. There's a sort of feel with this that you've got the photo, but now it really needs editing. I kind of feel like it needs more done to it, Brian. I think, maybe you shift the if this circle where the branch has been cut off is important, or if it's not important. And I think this is part of where I get slightly confused when you say it's the textures of the bark. The problem is this circle acts a bit like a bullseye. It just sort of attracts all the attention. Your eye just gets drawn straight here, and yet if that's not the purpose of the photo, then it's pulling our eye away from it. And another problem that we have as well from the texture is there's this bright green patch over in the right side where we've got ferns coming down, which is also competing for our attention. So the two things that are primarily competing are the green ferns and this big circle in the middle, neither of which are about the layers of bark which are pulling apart, which is like we have over on the left here, or over in the kind of middle right, which is what you were talking about. So I think this is one of those where it's about understand the story first. I suppose there's a kind of triple thing, and I might just start saying this a bit more until it becomes a bit of a mantra that everybody has in their head. Think story, composition, lighting. The first thing is, what's the story? And by story, I don't mean it has to be War and Peace. It's just this notion that there's a reason you pulled your camera out and pointed it at whatever it is you've ever taken a photo of. There's something that grabbed your attention. And the clearer you can be in your head about what it is that's grabbing your attention, the easier it is to then make all the decisions that you take next. So if you come up against a piece of, tree bark and you go, what I really love is the bark, and then you say, what is it about the bark I love? What I really love is the way it's sort of folded coming out of that. Your next decision then is the composition. How am I going to compose this photo that absolutely maximizes that intention, that bit that I'm finding really interesting? And then the third part of that is light. Is there anything I can do with the light that's also going to emphasize the mood or the text, in this case with texture? This looks like it was taken on a fairly dull day, or you're under a lot of shade. Well, we know from when I was talking about the stone carving last week that a stronger light would really ramp up the sense of texture and depth within the tree. So lots of different things to think about there, Brian. I hope some of those are useful and helpful. But thanks for sending that one in. Yeah, tree bark is always is a good place to go if you're looking for texture. Okay. So where are we? Where? Okay. Go back a little bit. Talking about the groins, which Roy mentioned here. Ben says groins are there to help prevent the sand being moved along the beach if the wave comes predominantly from one direction. Aha. Okay. And VG says a groin in US, a groin, Groin, not YNE, built perpendicular to the shore, is a rigid hydraulic structure built from an ocean shore in coastal engineering, or from banks in a river that interrupt the water flow and limit the movement of sediment. Okay, so that's another one. Ben's saying, I knew my 1978 O-level geography would pay off one day. Excellent. And VG says, courtesy of Wikipedia. Cool. Okay, yes, and Roy's come in also saying groins were built into the sea from a beach to check erosion and drifting. Well, there you go. That's brilliant. That's something I've learned something new about. I don't know, maybe it rings a vague bell, but it's so far distant, I certainly can't really access that memory. So things put into the sand so that the beach doesn't get sort of swept and pushed way too far off. Great stuff. Yeah, good. Also great stuff for texture to go and photograph for sure. Okay, brilliant. Well, thank you to Ben, Roy, and VG for all leaping in to help my curiosity there. Okay, so Pat's here. Says sorry I'm late. Oh, I'm glad you could make it, Pat. It's always good to see you. And now April says, onto the tree now. Looks like a mirror in the middle. Well, that could have been an interesting idea to actually have a mirror sitting in the tree. VG says feels like someone pegged a woodpecker hole. And Jim says he likes the bark breaking up. And VG says nice circles like rivulets in the circle saw when Kim zoomed in. Okay, yeah, and I think really actually kind of if you think about this, Brian, what others are picking up on is in the circle. And if you zoomed in and made that circle the story, then you would be looking at the textures of the rings in it and the cracks in it and what have you. So but it's a different story to the actual bark that's around. And so it's a case of deciding which one it is you want to make your story about and then emphasizing that bit. Cool. Okay. And Brian says, thanks for your comments, Kim. Excellent. Okay. Next up then, let's see what we have. And the next one is from Christine. Now, Christine, welcome. Is new to the group. I came across Christine on another site just early this afternoon, and immediately she sent in this and said, flower in my garden caught my eye for texture. Thanks for inviting me to your page. I hope this works. I'm very new to photography, only 1.5 months into learning. Well, that's great. I mean, if you're watching this, Christine, or watching this back later, there's make the most of the group Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres. We've got a great team here. We've got a great bunch of members and visitors, and they're a really cool crew. Everybody's really helpful and warm and friendly, and everybody knows what it's like to start out and go, I'm really excited by photography, and I'm also not sure what I'm doing, and I'm trying something and this works and that doesn't, and sometimes I know why and sometimes I don't. And so the whole point of Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres, the Facebook group and these podcasts, is to help you get past your sticking points, ask the questions, put your photos in, look for critique, and we'll do our best to help you. So this photo then, now this has another sense of texture. And again, I suppose you've got a wide aperture here, narrow depth of field, so everything's blurring out in the background, a little bit blurred in the foreground, and just behind the immediate foreground we then have the focused, more sharper parts of the flowers. And the flowers are soft, and I think you've got, it's not just a single individual flower. What you have is the whole mass of the flowers, but you do get that sense of the sort of soft petals. And we're not entirely sure, maybe these spikes are hard, but they don't look hard. Maybe that's something that will come out of experience. So, but certainly there's a lot of texture within there. I think I would be tempted with this. It feels like it could probably do with sharpening up a little bit in the editing process. But then I'm never entirely sure when you put pictures into Facebook compress them and sometimes kind of blur them out a little bit as well. So it might just be something as simple as that. But yes, there's a nice softness there. So, and I think 1.5 months into photography, joining a group, putting your images in is a really great thing to do. So I think let's give you a smug point too. Oh, so here we go. In the comments, we've already got a few people welcoming you and saying welcome to Jackie, VG, John, Megan are all saying welcome to Christine as well, which is lovely. And Gary says, I love that shallow depth of field on the flower and the soft diffuse forms in the background. So that's great. Yeah, really nice, really nice. Now, by absolute contrast, in terms of the soft flowery textures, this on the one hand could look like a soft flowery texture if you're not entirely sure what it is you're looking at. However, this is Gary. Gary says this image was taken in a Mediterranean biome of the Eden complex in Cornwall. This densely packed orbicular cacti and their myriad spines always make me feel slightly uncomfortable, having once fallen into these things and having a hand riddled with their tiny barbs, which took months to really heal and get better. Oh, I feel for you, Gary. Ouch. So the story tells us that these are not soft and fluffy. They're not, it's because unless you know, it's not necessarily obvious. It kind of looks like it could be just be sort of slightly furry. But if this is cactus and these are hard spines and they've gone into your flesh and then it's taken months to stop, that must have been really painful. So yeah, absolutely feel for you there, Gary. Now, interestingly, with this photo, is it feels, if you don't know that it's a cactus, or you're not sure what it is, I don't know whether you necessarily pick up on that kind of texture. There is texture here. In a way, this is more like a pattern than a texture, I think. What you've got is you've got the repeated pattern running across. You could make a wallpaper out of this really well, whether it's a background wallpaper for phones or devices or something like that. But essentially it's repeating patterns. Now, that's interesting for wallpaper. I think as a standalone photo, it makes it slightly more difficult because there isn't a sort of single point of focus. Your eye kind of goes around the place, which is great for background wallpaper, but with a photo, I think you kind of want to be drawn to something. So my recommendation if you're, ever back there again, is to pretty much pick out one of these. So say, you pick out this one or something, getting closer, allow the others to overlap a bit, excuse me, and that's fine. We can sort of have little bits sort of coming in to know that there are more about. But really what you want to do is you want to grab one, whether it's this one or it's this one, and sort of mostly fill the screen with one of them. And so that's where, and you can see this, if you've got it like this, again, slightly off center, so we're going for that sort of slight rule of thirds here, but we've got the bigger one right here. All these lines on the cactus actually just draw your attention straight into the middle. So at this point, whatever the center of the cacti is like, you need to, that's got to be really sharp. That's the bit you're focusing on. That's the bit that's got to just be absolutely pin sharp, because that's where the eye is getting drawn to. Once you've been drawn to there, your eye is going to spread out and draw in the rest of it. And I think that would then make a more interesting standalone photo. But pulled out, I think it makes a rather nice kind of patterned wallpaper. So, thanks very much for that one. And yeah, okay, have a smug point just as a kind of compensation for the for the jagging your hand into the cactus. Yeah, I can feel that just a bit too much, I think. Cool. Okay, what have we got here? A few more welcomes for Christine. Vandana says, "Wow, amazing." VG says, "I love the thorny pumpkin." April can certainly feel it. It says she can feel it, the prick for that. Vandana says it looks like thorny melons. Nuria says, "Love the Eden Project. Recommend it to everyone." Very spiky though. Love it. Yeah, and actually the Eden Project, if you ever do get down to Cornwall, which is in south west England, so if you're looking at a map of Britain, bottom left hand corner, as far as you can go, that's Cornwall. It is an amazing place. We went down there many years ago now, probably about close to 20 years, but it's in an old quarry that was disused. They essentially set up they did all these biodomes where they have all sorts of different kind of landscapes and parts of, so they've got kind of tropical areas, they've got desert areas and what have you, and it's really is an amazing place. Definitely worth going and taking a look. And yeah, certainly if you're into your plants, you will find all sorts there. Take your camera, there will be so many textures to explore. Where are we? Oh yeah, April was wondering about cropping it in, and Jackie also enjoys the tighter crop, as does Jim. And April says, "I would like to macro on one of those." Yeah, okay. I must admit, this is one I am slightly surprised with the entries on here, that there's very little in the way of really kind of close-up macro textures. I suppose when I was starting to talk about the idea of doing texture as a challenge, that's really kind of what I had in mind, was to get right up close and really kind of check out, because when I think of texture, I think of, whether it's like fur or a towel or, some kind of cloth or material, or the leaf bumps or things like that, or even the spikes and thorns from a cactus or whatever, where you just get in really close and those textures become massively emphasized then. The ridges and the grooves and the spikes, or the softness and the velvetiness, all these things become more exaggerated the closer you get in. So something to think about. Of course, not everybody has a macro lens, but if you do have a macro option, or even you can zoom in as far as you can, I think textures very often can become enriched. Obviously, it depends on what exactly it is you're doing, but there is a kind of a realm for doing this sort of, where you get in close and it becomes almost abstract, where you're seeing a really thick texture and you can kind of get a sense of feeling it, but you might not even be totally sure what it is you're looking at. Okay, so next up then, let's take a look at, Stacey's here. Stacey's just turned up, saying good afternoon, just got back home. Welcome, Stacey, glad you could make it along. So our next picture comes in from Jackie. Jackie says, "This is my entry for the texture challenge. I felt the texture added to the story of the image, that of a ship seeing its demise on the rugged rocks. This was taken at Cape Agulhas, the most southern tip of the African continent. I put in one of my own skies as a sky replacement with Photoshop to give it an eerie or more surrealistic feel." Now, there's sort of several textures going on here, some of which I think work really well, Jackie, and some of which I'm less convinced by. So, first of all, what we have is we've got, so shipwreck, wonderful rusty ship just sitting in the bay there. That's potentially full of texture. And then you've got all these rocks in the foreground, also very textured. And the sea isn't calm, dead calm, smooth, bits of texture in there. I think the bit that worries me most actually is, if I'm absolutely honest, Jackie, is the sky that you've replaced it, that you've put in. The couple of things here really. First of all, where everything else has got a sharpness to it, the blurriness of the sky doesn't really fit in with the rest of the picture, so it immediately leaps out as feeling a little bit different. And the other thing, and a really, really key thing here, is the fact that what you've got here is a light source, whether that's a sun or a moon, I'm not sure, but that's obviously like a key light source. Now, if there was a sun there, the shadows would be completely different. The shadows wouldn't fall in the direction that they're falling in. And as such, what happens when we look at it, the brain just goes, that feels false. It doesn't feel convincing as a picture. So essentially what happens is when I look at the photo, instead of looking at it as a complete photo, I'm looking at the edits. And it's one of these things with photography which I think is so easily done if we're not really careful about it. There's a notion whereby if you can see the edit, you've kind of failed, because when people are looking at pictures, you want them to be involved in the story. If you think about, like, if you're watching a film, you're involved in the film. You're absolutely, there you are, and it's going great. But if something comes into that film which doesn't quite feel right, maybe the acting is particularly bad, or the CGI is quite terrible, or you become aware that it's a dodgy blue screen effect or something like that, you immediately stop being in the film and you suddenly find yourself in your seat being aware that you're sitting here watching the film. You stopped being absorbed in it and you are now aware of yourself watching it. And at that point, the filmmaker has failed. Similarly, if you're listening to interviews on the radio, and I know this, I did a stint in radio where we used to do we'd interview people, we'd talk to them for about 45 minutes and then edit it down into a little kind of 3 to 4 minute vignette, which then went out on the radio show. And so you had to be really careful with the edit so that it sounded like it was just a 3 or 4 minute interview that just flowed. That somebody came in, sat down for 4 minutes, talked clearly and left again. That never ever happened. It was always anything between 25 minutes and 2 hours, on average about 45 minutes to get that 4 minutes. Now, when you edited it, if you heard the edits, if you heard where somebody sort of joined 2 sentences and the voice doesn't go right, or there's or something, what would happen is people would stop listening to the interview and start listening for the edits. At which point then, the better the edit, the less you know it's been edited. And I think with editing, it is one of those things where this is what you've got to kind of work out with it. How well is the editing contributing to the photo? Now, I think with this photo, Jackie, I think it's already a potentially very dramatic photo. You've got the rocks in the foreground, you've got the water, and then you've got the rusty ship. And this in itself is a really exciting idea for a photo. I don't know what the natural sky was like. Certainly worth going back when there's different skies, I think. But the sky that you've placed in, just to me, does not feel natural. And so I look at it and I stop being involved in the, wow, look at the interesting rusty boat and the interesting rocks and the interesting landscape, and just start thinking, oh, she's edited it this way. So it's a tricky one. And I think it's worth thinking about. Particularly when you're talking about sky replacement as well, is that if you are going to replace the sky, you have to try and make it as sympathetic to the original picture as you can. I don't know whether you watched the one that we did a few weeks ago, where Robert had his car and a reflection in the water, and I used the sky replacement tool for that. And I talked quite a bit there about the notion of getting a sky which was sympathetic to the picture, so it didn't look like we'd edited a sky in. So if you missed that, maybe worth going back and taking a little look at it. But having said that, I mean, I see where you're coming from, and I think there's a lot of potential with this. And certainly, if I lived there, I would love to get back to that's to the rusty old ships, shipwrecks, next to rocks and stuff like that, I think has huge potential for a lot of really interesting photography. So I hope you'll go back and have some more fun with that. So, but thanks for sending that in, Jackie, and kind of giving me the opportunity to talk about that notion of sky replacement and the importance of edits that don't look like edits, I think. Because I think it's a really important thing that a lot of people miss. So thanks very much. Right, okay. Let's see. What have we got here? Okay, talking about getting close up earlier, Ben says, I find it difficult to get very close up but still have some sort of composition. The texture filled the frame too much. There is a point with that, but you're absolutely right. But you're trying to find the balance where you can. Yeah, I mean, obviously, if you go too close, you can either lose the texture or you can lose the sense of story. But maybe there's something within, a bit like the cactus, where I say you find an aspect of it which is moved slightly to one side, or in the case of wood, maybe there is a knot which is interesting, or there's some kind of shape. Playing around with the composition, and you can play around with composition whether it's at landscape level with hills and mountains, or it's right down in the absolute micro macro level of only a few centimeters across. There's always a place to try and find line and shape and form, and this is part of what we're exploring. Gary says, keep your camera warm under your coat if you visit the jungle biome on the cold winter day. I had to wait 15 minutes for the condensation to stop forming on my cold camera body. Now there's a trip, there's something to know about. Yes, you do have to be very careful if your camera gets too cold, that suddenly, boom, condensation comes. I've had this problem. Your lens steams up, and until you kind of get past that, you find you're unable to take the photos. Very frustrating. Right, so where are we? So VG likes the ship, Vandana thinks the ship's lovely, Sandra likes the landscape image, April likes the rocks, talking about the texture. Jackie says, okay, I can see what you're getting at, and that the sky distracts. April said, should it be cropped too as well for texture purposes, not as a landscape picture? I think that's also a good point, really. There is a case of, is it about the texture, is it about the landscape? And there's texture in everything we photograph, and I suppose really if what we're trying to do is say this is about the texture, then we need to decide which bit of texture it is that works the best. So yes, it's back to that thing, I think, like I started saying with Ben's, but I've kind of become a bit of a running theme also with Gary's there, which is there. I think with texture, the drive is getting closer. But obviously it kind of depends on the picture you're going for. Right. Okay. Oh, and April says, what an amazing find. And certainly I can't help but think that as well. I just love the idea of shipwrecks. Wow. What isn't there to be excited about as a photographer if you can find something like that? Cool. Okay. Next up then, we're going to go to Jim. Where are we? Ah, yes. So Jim says, hi Kim, this is my image for the texture challenge. Wild cotton always takes me back to my childhood when we lived in the countryside. The peat bogs were always covered with these cotton plumes. As children, we would collect them because they're so soft to touch. Brings back so many memories. And yeah, it's another one of these things where going back to that idea that an awful lot of texture is tied into memory. That, especially with the idea of that close-up texture, when you can imagine you kind of self running your thumb or your hand or your fingers or something like this, you can almost go like, rubbing it against the side of your face, that sort of softness of the cotton. Now, the only thing I tend to feel with this, Jim, slightly, I think it's a lovely one, and I think, fine, have your smug point. It's a really nice memory there as well. I tap into what you're saying there. My only sort of slight feeling here is that what's happened is some of the highlights have become a little bit blown. And I think just stopping down a little bit would have made all the difference in just bringing out the texture. The way you can see it is, and let's just open this in Photoshop a moment and show you what I mean. If I just, I'll duplicate that layer for a moment, and I'll take this into Camera Raw and just drag the highlight slider down. So we're looking here, and if I take the highlight and I just pull it down a bit, do you see how much more texture just comes out. Now, we're always going to be slightly limited because of whatever settings you have, but just pulling it down a little bit and we've got more texture has come on show. Now, we could, if we want, even boost the texture slider or the clarity slider. Although, oddly enough, when we do that, we take away some of the softness, so we've kind of got to be careful with that. But if we do now, if we feel a whole lot's been darkened, then maybe what we do is we could mask it and then just paint in over the mask. Oh, turn that to white. Oh, so it's sitting at 16%, that's why, okay. And just bring in some of that texture just on a couple of bits there. And what we notice then is the difference between that and that gives us a... So at this point, each of the strands becomes a little bit more visible. But I'm nitpicking really here, Jim, just a thought. But yeah, I think that it's a nice... there's also, depending on how... playing around with composition a little bit. Let's do content aware for a moment. And what would it be like if this was straighter and you had that on more of a diagonal? What would that look like? Just do... I think that becomes that's maybe a slightly more interesting, because there's a sort of feeling with where you were, it's sort of either not quite diagonal enough or not quite straight enough. Maybe pulling it something like that, or maybe what would happen if we sort of turned it and made this a little bit more diagonal and this a little bit more straight? Then you've got the sense of the stalk coming up and bending over, and then this dropping down. So there's ways to play with it as well. I think, just kind of tilting it backwards and forwards could be a little bit of fun as well. Anyway, nice little thoughts there. Thanks for sending that one in, Jim, and the memories of the cotton. Right, okay, where are we? So, all right, Pat says, I really love this. Clever Jim. April says, looks really silky. Sandra says, Photoshop adjustments really bring out the texture, which April agrees with. Ben says, thinking of what Kim said the other week about echoes, might be good to have other bog cotton heads out of focus in the background. And I think, yes, I think that's a really good idea, Ben, is that idea of, you have it there, but if you've got hints of other ones disappearing into the distance, then that can kind of lift it as well. So, nice suggestion. Aviji says the texture gets better after the edit, and Jim says, thanks, Kim, for your suggestions. Cool. Okay, we're doing well. We're working our way forward. And we're now heading on to John from Ohio, who says, shale on the bank of a river. Taken while on a hike through one of our local parks, the colours and layers caught my eye. Now, I suppose I have to, what texture? So you've got the shale, the sort of slate, or, this very, very thin layered stone, which just crumbles. And I know, you can kind of feel like you can get your fingers into it and just bits would snap off. And then on top of that, though, we've got all this texture of dead leaves as well, which have kind of come down. Now, I suppose my question here is, John, is how edited is this? How much of the colour's been boosted? Because the colours do look very vibrant, and I almost kind of feel over vibrant, and I wonder whether it's been slightly overcooked in the editing. Now that might just be my limitations on slate and shale in Britain don't tend to be quite as brightly coloured. There's a lot of yellow on here, like it's almost like a yellow lichen, except for the fact you don't tend to get a yellow lichen. Lichens tend to be green, at least certainly around here. So it feels a little bit, again, like that vibrance tool has been sort of nudged slightly to the right, slightly oversaturated. But I could be wrong. If that's actually, if you've done barely any editing to it and that is just as it looks, then, what a find. That would be quite amazing. But yeah, there's lots of textures within this. I quite like the kind of diagonal shape and the line running down, that sort of yellow line sort of cutting through. It is busy though. There are and a little bit slight problem of trying to find one place to rest the eyes. And I always tend to feel to come back then to, I think there's nothing wrong with having more than one subject in a photo, but what you really need is you need a primary subject. You need the first place the eye gets drawn to. And that's your primary story. That's the bit that everybody zooms in on and you go, right, that's it. Now I've got the first bit. Everything else is in support mode. Everything else is then backing up or adding to the richness of the story of the first part. And with this, it feels like, again, there's sort of competing stories. It's really interesting. There's lots of texture here, but I'm not sure quite where to look first. You know, here we've got some lovely, sort of nice bits of texture here, but then got loads of sort of bits running down here. I mean, that in itself becomes quite an interesting shot. There's almost, you know, here we've got the dead leaves on the thing. Now they're sort of not so well separated, so you would need to sort of play around with the editing differently if you were doing that. Over in the corner here, we've got a mix of, now you see, even something like that I think becomes quite interesting. We've got this dead leaf up here looking almost like some kind of creature sitting on it, and these sort of steps going down. Got these layers here, and then we've got these diagonals coming over on the right. And something like that, I think, you can create a composition out of, and you create a kind of story with. But we know with this, when we look at this, the eye gets drawn to the leaf first. And certainly then if you were editing it, you would edit it in such a way that the leaf sort of becomes slightly bolder compared to the background. So, whereas up here, it obviously doesn't get drawn to that leaf first because there's all these other things. So I think it's a really interesting shape. I think there's so much texture there. Like I said, the bit I'm uncertain about is the amount of editing you've done, whether you've maybe slightly overcooked it or whether those are the natural colours or not. But primarily it's then thinking about that, even though it is about texture, like I was saying to Gary earlier about with the cacti, that it's good to have, you still kind of need to think composition as something to draw your eye to first. But lovely, well spotted, and I mean also the fact that we've got the water down below as well, dead leaf floating in it. I can certainly see why you got drawn to it. So many thanks for sending that one in, John, much appreciated. Right. So where are we? Okay, so April says beautiful colour. Ben says the shale looks so crunchy. Yeah, it really does. You could kind of get your fingertips into it and just start breaking it up. Becca says, wow, love this, John. John says, only slightly enhanced, mostly natural. That's really, well, yeah, I can certainly see then why you would want to grab your camera and pull out and see the rich colours, very rich colours. Vandana says, I would go in more at a place. April says, nice, John, great find, zoom to the upper right. Yeah, so a couple of, Vandana again saying, choosing a focus point, I guess. So yes, Jackie also says crop a bit. So there's other people kind of coming in with, I'm not sure whether they're just backing me up or also saying the same thing. There's always a time delay here between, it's about 15 seconds between the time I say something and it appears on your thing, and then by the time you've commented and then I've come off the picture. I'm never entirely sure what point the comment came up. Sandra says lovely rustic textures. Gary says that's iron oxide over the shale, essentially rust. This is often present when the shale was laid down. Yeah, I would have thought that was slightly more orange than yellow. But where are we? April says, oh yeah, love the yellow on the slates. Oh, and Ben says you do get yellow lichens as well. Okay, fair enough. John says, thanks, appreciate the pointers. Jim says, lovely colours on the shale and the cropping does improve. Cool, okay, lots of ideas then, lots to play around with. Right, okay, let's move on to Kazia then. Now, Kazia sent in this photo, says, good evening, I decided to change my image. Because she put in a different image first, when she said, I hope this was the right decision. Thoughtful emoji. Says, one of my multicoloured orchids image taken in the flat with a natural light coming through the window. I blurred the background in editing to bring attention to the main subject. Okay, so I think you're on the right track with, you've got natural lighting coming from a window, which is always a good, if as long as it's not like a hard sunlight, which it isn't, you've just got a natural window light which creates a nice soft lighting, which if you're doing soft petaled flowers like an orchid, is a good lighting. And you're trying to make sure that the background isn't interfering with the picture. So these are really good starts. I can understand why you get drawn to the idea of doing an orchid. I think two slight problems that we got here. One is the actual blurring itself. Whatever tool it is you've been using to blur is kind of made it a bit funny around the edges. We can see this grey, but then you can see this darker patch around here, and that's when it kind of comes from its, and then the overlap, so that this top of the part of the leaf has also sort of ended up having the grey overlapping it. You can see it again here. Around the edges, it's like there's so much blur on the background that you've ended up with this sort of ridge, sort of from just inside to just outside, which is sort of where the blur is overlapping. And what that's doing is it's taking away from the sharpness and the colour of the actual flower. So blurring background is one of these things you kind of got to be careful of. What you would almost be better off, depending on if you've got, I'm not sure whether you're doing this with your phone or whether you've got a camera, what you're almost better off doing is playing around, certainly have a wide aperture to create a soft, a shallow depth of field, so that the background naturally goes back, I think, is one way to do it. Or you try and angle it such that it's a fairly dark background, so that all the attention goes to the light part. You expose for, the lighter part on one of the flowers, so that the dark parts become much darker. The other kind of feeling I have with this is that there's a sort of slight conflict as to where we look first. In terms of, because what happens is you've got the bit that grabs all our attention straight away is the blue and magenta, or the blue and pink part of the orchid. Because it's so bright, because it's so vivid, this is what grabs our attention. Yet this top one is out of focus. The one underneath is much more in focus, but it's underneath that one. So our attention is getting drawn down into this corner, but it feels like other things are kind of getting in the way. Alternatively, we get drawn to this part, which is nice and sharp, which has got lovely texture and a sense of sharpness to it. But we can't really look at this so clearly because our eye gets pulled over to the left to this one. So it's back to this idea then of where does the eye go? And if you have more than one primary subject, there's a conflict. There's a conflict for viewing it. We're not sure whether we should be looking here or we're looking there, and we get pulled backwards and forwards. And as such, the photo doesn't flow in the same kind of way. I would say, though, if you've got, amazing coloured orchids, go back and try again and keep trying with this, because there's a lot of potential in this. Like I say, first of all, if you've got the control over the camera, shallow depth of focus, but also make sure where it's going to be most focused. But then also try a dark background, maybe even a dark cloth or something held behind it. Dark piece of card is quite a good idea. Something like that will help you to isolate the colours, and then decide if you're going to have both the blue and pink and the sort of creamy white ones. Arrange the angle of it such that maybe so that the blue pink one is more central or is supported by the other ones rather than conflicting. So I hope that makes a bit of sense to you, Kazia. I will just say, actually, you swapped out your other photo, and I really quite liked your other photo, which was this one. Which here I feel this one does work really quite well. And what we've got here is we've got the beautiful softness of the petals of the cherry blossom. And to go back to Ben's point on Jim's cotton, is we've got the echoes in the background. We've got, it's nice and sharp here, but these little pink patches in the background here we know are echoes of more blossom. There's a nice diagonal of this branch here runs through, kind of creates a sense of energy and movement. But then you've got flowers either side, which kind of create a slight mirroring effect, but not absolute mirroring. We've got the one here, and then these sort of curve around at the bottom. And I must admit, actually, as a composition and also as a response to the term texture, this one kind of does it for me much more, Kazia. So there's a little bit of feeling that kind of maybe you sort of swap, not being quite so quick to gone with your first instinct. I think really with this. Anyway, thanks for sending those ones in, Kazia. So let's see what other comments we've got here. So Jim's saying lovely colours of the shale, cropping does improve, and Nuria agrees with all the above comments. Right, so then we're into the orchids. April says gorgeous blue, Stacey says lovely orchids. Sandra says really interesting colours for orchids, never seen those before. Vandana says wow, beautiful colours, would love to have seen the droplets. April says, oh, April's got to run for an appointment. Well, I hope you... glad I got your picture in early then, April. I hope everything goes well and you enjoy catching up on this later. Megan says my eyes immediately go to the blue flower. That's, yep, absolutely. You get dragged over, and it's partly because it's not just the blue, it's the pink within the blue, which I think is because the pink is very close to the red, and as we were talking back when we were talking about the red challenge, red just becomes like a kind of selective colour. It just draws all the attention. Nuria says the blue one is beautiful. Jim says orchids are lovely, maybe either the blue or the yellow. Jackie Love says the pink one's great. Kazia's now laughing at the fact that I'm probably talking about the fact that she's swapped the wrong photos. And John also says he loves the pink flower shot. So cool. Okay, excellent. Right, let's. Where are we now then? We're getting to, Megan next. So Megan, also new one joining us. I think Megan joined the group about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago. So Megan says, I'm still discovering textures. These rocks are found on Flathead Lake in Montana, and they just seemed out of place. So this is a lovely sense of texture here, where you look straight down and you've got all these pebbles. And what we've also got, we do have one large one here, which has got all these ridges within it, which then it grabs the attention first. So I think, in terms of what we were talking about before, there's lots of texture, but there is a kind of primary one to come in on. Having said that, I think for this one, Megan, that this is where having it off center might have worked better. I don't know how familiar you are with the idea of the rule of thirds, but that notion of part of the what it is with photography, mostly, not always, there are exceptions to it, but mostly the center of a photo tends to kind of be the dead zone. It's the most balanced zone, but it's also the point where there's least tension. If you move things off center, you kind of add a bit more tension and then thereby add a little bit more interest. So what I'll do here, just to kind of show you briefly, I think there's a couple of different directions you could have gone with this. So I'm just to give you a sense, I'm using content auto content aware. So I'm going to add in and move this, and it will generate extra stones around it that weren't actually there. But it's just this idea of what I think you should have maybe done is sort of move the camera left or right. Now, being dead in the center, I think you either kind of want to go up a bit or down a bit. So there's a notion of, imagine if we take this and we were to move it up into one corner, something like that. So this is where the main stone is. Oh, okay, why is that not done that? Let's do that, try that again. And it's not doing the autofill. What a pain. I have no idea why not. That's okay. I think actually I need to just sort of crop it. I think this happened to me once before. Then if I do, no, it's still not doing it. Why is Photoshop deciding to play up at a point where, okay, if I do that and then I do that, no, it's still not doing it. What a pest. Okay, I'm not going to be able to show you on here then. It was doing the autofill earlier when I did Jim's. Get the content aware. Oh, now it's doing bits. Okay, so let's just try this again. If we... Okay, imagine then we pulled that down to the right. Would that work? Ah, now it's thinking about it. There we go. Yes, so what we're looking at here... Sorry, Megan. We've now got that up to one side. Now, part of the problem here, I think, is maybe there's slightly less interesting texture down at the bottom than there was at the top. Or rather, I'm less certain, really, kind of what's happening. So I think, really, I'm kind of slightly more drawn to the idea of what if we had it in the bottom left corner. Something like that. Or maybe even tilted it slightly. Yeah, something like that. Now, obviously, it didn't have these exact rocks here. And that's maybe just a little bit too much there. And we come back in, pull that in a little bit more. So that this primary stone is sitting in the sort of bottom part here. It is tricky here because I think this has created a bunch of stones up here which now echo that one, which I didn't really want. But ultimately, what I'm trying to get across is that I think that an off-center works better than dead center. And even if we kind of moved it in a little bit like that, I think that sort of becomes a bit more interesting. We've kind of zoomed in a bit. We're allowing stones around it. We've not got that in dead center. And in fact, actually, maybe I would even just trim that bottom corner off a little bit more. Something like that. And I think the balance of that somehow works a little bit better rather than having it right in the middle. I seem to have strayed way off the point and gone off on tangents. I'll not hang around too much longer on this. But basically, Megan, all I was saying is that I think you can play around with the composition a bit more. But I like the textures of it. What's also interesting with this is you know that if it was wet, it would have an entirely different look as well. So if you can get if this is down at the beach, if you can get like a little container with water, make the pebbles wet as well, that can be really interesting as well for adding a different sense of texture. If you think about Ben's wet wood, you know what that would feel like. You also know what the wet stones would feel like. But the sunlight on there is creating nice deep shadows, is giving us that real sense of up and down with it. So thank you very much for sending that one in, Megan. I think smug points. Yeah, have a smug point. This is your first entry into the to the podcasts, and you've turned up as well. So that's great. Cool. Right, where are we now? All right, Kazia said, I couldn't decide. Haha. At the moment, I'm obsessed with the orchids, therefore my choice. Fair enough. John from Ohio is saying he loves Montana. And Vandana says, amazing picture, Megan. Sandra says she loves the colours in the pebbles. Ben says, I'd like to try turning Megan's picture upside down so the light looks more like it's coming from the top of the picture. That's certainly worth playing around with too, I think, yes. And Jim says, the colours of the pebbles are interesting. Megan says, I fully agree. Thank you for the feedback. Cool. Okay. Actually, I'll tell you what. Let me just try Ben's suggestion for a moment. Image rotation, 180 degrees. Ah, yeah. This is true. I hadn't even really clocked that. But yes, the shadow now looks like it's coming from above rather than below. Nicely spotted, Ben. So if we go back to the original photo and we rotate it 180 degrees, I think, yes, I think you're right. That notion of the light coming from above, it feels more like it's coming from above, seems to work better. And then if we kind of crop down like that, so we get it that slightly off to the left and the top, then I think that, yes, that certainly makes for a slightly more interesting version of that photo. Yeah, cool. Thanks for suggesting that one, Ben. Oh, I'll come back to that one in a sec. Where were we? And yep, okay, so, and Sandra says that, yeah, the rotation works really well as well. And Megan also agrees. That's a lot better. Thanks, Ben. Cool. Excellent. Right. Okay. So we just saw Morven's picture next, which is this one, which I thought was rather lovely. So Morven says, my contribution for the texture challenge, taken in a spring morning, poking about the back of our Bigland house, where John Paul Jones, the founder of the American Navy, was born just outside Dumfries in southern Scotland. So I wonder about cropping it more, or will that lose context? Well, first of all, Morven, I think this is great. I think, to that notion of the really rusty old lock, again, a little bit reminds me of the slate from John's picture as well. It's one of those things, you've got all those multiple layers, and you can kind of imagine kind of getting your thumbnail under and just kind of flaking away bits of rust. Lovely colours. Now, as you say, there's kind of two ways you can go about this. If you go in, if you go in close like this, we're then not entirely sure what the picture is. But we know it's rusty. We don't know what it's rusting of. We have no sense of it being the lock on a gate or anything like that. But the picture is then very much about the texture of this rust. And cropped something like that, where again we've got this slightly to the left, we've got that little gap over there, although that is drawing quite a bit of attention because it's just a bright patch. But it's, it's quite interesting. I think you could get away with that. You could get away with, if you had a macro lens of some kind, doing something like this, getting right in with the texture. Alternatively, though, it is quite interesting seeing the lock as well, because when you see the lock, it's not just the rust, it's the paint as well that's come off. The only thing I would say is there's probably too much bar over on the right here. You don't need as much of that, and it does feel like it's just needs straightening up a fraction. So in terms of crop, I would be very tempted to just kind of, you could pull in that and then just rotate it just a fraction to something like that. I think, well, maybe you could even lose just a little bit more of that. Maybe because it's interesting where the light is hitting the edge a bit, but we don't need the whole bar of that. And at that point, maybe we've got a bit too much on the background over that. So something like that, maybe. Well, of course, this is me now. You can just forever keep cropping in closer and closer. Ends up almost a bit like the old wonky table leg, where you keep cutting a little bit more off, and then you have to go and cut round the other legs as well. I start cropping in on one side and find that I need to keep cropping in on the others. But yeah, that's great. And actually, if you're playing around with the editing as well, you can really ramp up this. Of course, you've got to be careful of overcooking it, but because it's quite bright around the edges, I think something like a vignette on this, we just kind of pull in the shadows a little bit on the edges, and then texture, what does that do? Kind of careful overcook. Maybe the clarity. I think the clarity, and maybe actually let's pull down the highlights, bring up the shadows, play with the clarity a little bit. Kind of intensifies it a little bit. Although we do have to be careful about that sort of slight overcooking if we're not. Cancel that. If we're not too careful. But lovely piece. And so to go back to your original question, do you crop in more or less? I think the simple answer is it's kind of up to you. It's back to that. What's the story? If the story is about, and when we look at it here, it is about the rusty lock on the gate, and so that's giving you one story. If you're going to crop in, you then crop right in, or rather not even crop in, but just sort of get in closer with your camera, and in a kind of macro kind of thing, take a shot of the close-up of the rust. So either of those would work as an option. So thank you very much for sending that one in, Morven. Right, what have we got here? Oh, Sandra says the rotation of the stones works really well. Ben says love the crumbly rust, and he's wondering what is it about rust that makes it so appealing. There is something. It's not just rust, decay in general. There's some episodes we talked about, probably about this time last year. I remember Paul, I think it was, sent in a picture of ruined building, and we went off on quite a tangent about the notion of decaying buildings, and whether it's rust, whether it's crumbling paintwork or crumbling brickwork or peeling paint. There is something about that whether partly it's texture. I don't know whether it's sort of sense of mortality or time, but there is something that's sort of almost infinitely interesting about it. Vandana says she loves your picture the way it is with the lock. Sandra says great rusty lock. Ben says I think showing the whole lock tells a story of what the rust used to be. Jim thinks the whole thing is nice as it was originally, and Roy says the rusty lock would look good in black and white, I think. Well, Roy, I think there's yet to come across a picture which you don't think would look better in black and white. No, Roy, I know Roy loves the black and white, and we're coming on to that in Roy's picture in a short while. Black and white can do a lot of work. But it's a tricky one, because yes, I think if you're going for texture alone, I think black and white really enhances it. But when you're talking about rust, I think there is something very much about the colour of rust, which is, so if you don't have that rust colour, it's slightly less obvious what it is you're looking at. But then if you're wanting the abstract, if you want to abstract it more, then going black and white can certainly do that. So again, it comes back to your interpretation. Where you're coming from with your photography is going to be different from where somebody else is coming in with their photography. And that's part of what we love about this. That's part of doing things like these challenges. It's quite simply that it's a fantastic way to get to see how different minds, different photographers, different brains and moods and eye sets and backgrounds are all coming in to take a single word like texture and interpret it in 20 different ways. So cool. Right, what else have we got here? Yeah, Ben's saying, yes, I was tempted to suggest decay as a challenge topic, but didn't dare. Maybe we'll do one of those. Rust has so much texture, it makes an interesting pattern, says Stacey. Right, okay, so a little quick reminder, we're halfway through, or maybe a little bit more. Just wanted to say, if you're finding these podcasts interesting or entertaining, and you feel you would like to support them, then buymeacoffee.com/Kim Ayres is the place to do it. Right, okay, so let's carry on. Next one up is Nicola, and so Nicola's picture says, this is my take on the texture challenge. I wanted to show how, although even when presented with a variety of textures in nature, they can sit side by side quite comfortably and essentially work together. And here we've got at least 3 different prominent textures. There's the shell from the snail, there's the rock, and then there's the moss as well. And each of these has got a slightly different texture. If you pick the rock's going to be very, very hard. It's all wet as well, which is creating a glistening, and that feeling of when you're sort of out in the countryside, you put your hand down to push yourself up or lean up or climb on something, and that feeling of wet rock, and then the sponginess of the moss as well, also another kind of great one. And then the shell as well, but the shell is very patterned, as it, of course, is much more fragile as well. I think composition-wise, you've gone for the kind of rule of thirds with this down, with the snail shell down in the sort of bottom left, and then we've got these nice diagonals coming in as well. So, smug points there, I think, Nicola. Nice touch. What I would say, though, is I think for this, you could actually get in closer and still have the same story, but actually essentially emphasize it. If what we're talking about is the stone, the moss, the shell, if we zoom into something like this, then what we have is we still have stone, moss and shell. The shell then becomes more prominent. Now, if you zoomed in, you would obviously need to make sure that the shell was that bit sharper in terms of focus. What also becomes slightly interesting here as well is when we get in this close, there's another texture comes out. We see this lovely little there's a dandelion seed come down, and this dandelion seed is then caught in the threads of spider web as well. So there's a whole bunch of texture down here, and you know, when we come in here, and I suppose at this point we're sort of getting close to playing around with macro lenses to see it. There's a whole nother world of stuff to explore. But I think certainly if you get in sort of something like about here, maybe just shuffle this over a fraction, but you've got the lovely green of the moss, we've got the diagonal of the gaps in the rocks, which still works, we've got the texture of the rocks, and we've got that added texture in there. But like I say, at this point you would need to just sharpen up, which again a macro lens or something would work really well with, to sharpen up on the shell. And there are a couple of bits where at this level the highlights are slightly blown, so you would adjust your settings fractionally. But there is very much a kind of a lovely nature feeling with that, especially with that kind of sponginess of the rock set against the hardness, sorry, the sponginess of the moss set against the hardness of the rock and the fragility of the shell. So lovely sets of textures there, Nicolette. So thanks for sending those ones in. Right. Sandra says, great composition and textures have been brought out really well. VG says she loves the spiral. Roy says, I love the close crop making the picture pop. Vandana says, an ecosystem, every level is so interesting. Yeah, I think you're right there, Vandana. I think there's, you know, it is that sort of micro world as well as the macro world. And you're getting lots of different things going in. Even no matter how close you go in, there's always something else to find. And Jim says this works on so many levels. Stacey says he loves the snail shell with the rocks as well. Excellent. Okay, next up then we have Nuria. And Nuria was out when she on a long walk where she came across this tree trunk covered in lichens in the middle of the wood, and wow, is that textured. And I must say, I also really love the idea that you've taken it as a diagonal rather than straight on. I think that really adds a kind of strength to the sense of the picture. You've got this sort of big, thick tree trunk with these amazing textured lichens over it. Having said that, but the kind of theme that I'm feeling all the way through this is the fact I just want to get in closer. There's that notion of the texture. The texture's what's... maybe it's because I set the texture as the texture challenge, that I want to get in, I want to feel it. I want to feel like almost if I face planted into this, what would it feel like pressed against my skin? And if we come in closer to something like this, then you can really see the dampness of the wood underneath, and we've really got all the incredible texture of these lichens. Now, part of the problem here is you're on a fairly shallow, you know, I'm not sure what your settings were, but everything goes out of focus up here. There is also a slight problem with these flowers here. Whilst on the one hand they add a little bit to the notion of a woodland floor, because they are getting very close to red there at that end of the spectrum, they grab the attention, they draw the eye over and take us away from the primary thing here, which is the wonderful texture of these lichens. And I think what I would be tempted to do is sort of move around and try and find a place whereby you're getting that mix of that wonderful sort of soggy wood underneath, but you're also getting some of the rich textures of the lichens as well. These wonderful curly bits, which is kind of endlessly kind of curling around, lots of ridge on them. You know, you sort of look up here and there's some fantastic textures. But also it's nice there's a diagonal feel. No matter where we zoom in, there's a kind of diagonal feel to it, which I think works quite well. So yeah, I'd be tempted, if you're back in something like that, get in close again, but move around until you can find a composition which you still find feels work. So remember that notion again, story first of all, what is it that's grabbing you? Is it the soggy wood? Is it the curliness of the textures of these particular lichens? Is it the group of, you know, work that out, then work your composition. And then, if possible, work the lighting. Although under these conditions, I understand you're just going to be working on whatever light that you happen to have. But then maybe also worth going back on a different day when the sunlight is coming through at a different angle. Always worth sort of playing around with that. So, yeah, lovely textures in that. Lovely find. You know, have yourself a smug point in the rear. Cool. Okay. So where are we? So, okay, so Naria says, I was hoping for a bit of sunlight too, but it didn't happen. No, yeah, it was one of those things you can't rely on. Jim says, full of texture, well done. Vandana says, wow, looks amazing close up, all those levels again. And VG says, it looks like an underwater scene. I could feel I could see a goldfish too. Yeah, I think that kind of lichen has almost it's almost like coral in a lot of ways. So yeah, I can see what you mean with that, VG. So Naria says, yay, thank you, Kim, very helpful. Good. I'm glad that was. Right, okay, so next on then we come to Robert. And as some of you know who've been watching Robert over the months won't be too surprised to find it's a car, although maybe more surprising it's not his car. This is a GTO classic. Robert says, this is one of the photos I took last year before really knowing what I was doing. It is a Pontiac GTO. In true amateur fashion, I forgot my SD card for my camera and had to fall back on my cell phone. There is something about this old car and the textures in the wood, rust and chrome that I found really interesting. I'm not sure the photo really works, but I like it. Okay, with this then, Robert. Yeah, absolutely. You see a GTO sitting behind a fence, you grab your camera, you realise you've got your SD card, at least you had the sense of mind to pull your phone out and still go for it. So, smug points for that. Smart, fast thinking. So the next question then is, what could you have done with this camera, with this photo? Is it kind of giving us what we want out of it? There are lots of textures in it, but the textures are also kind of competing with each other. And I think this is one of those classic things whereby it becomes kind of where's the story. Now, what you did do was you also sent me the original, which was this. And there's bits of this that I really quite like as well. And when I sort of look at this and then look back at this feels slightly overcooked again. It's almost like you kind of, you know, somewhere in between, or maybe just sort of slightly selectively between them, where you decide to sort of bring out the attention. But that aside, I think the part of the problem here is that there's 3 or 4 different stories you could get out of this, and I don't think you really have one of them nailed down. And I think that's it's coming back to what's the primary story with this. Now, so for example, it says GTO here, and you've clearly framed that within part of the fence. But for that, if that's the important bit, it's kind of you want to be in here, or maybe here with a little bit of headlight. And then that way you've got a bit of grille, a bit of headlight, and the GTO, that's the important bit. Alternatively, if it's about the car behind the fence, then you want to be a little bit back and get more of the fence in. Another thing you could do as well, I think, is actually being more straight on. If you were sort of moved over to your left a bit as you took the photo and actually get a more balanced sense of that grille and the lights showing on either side, and then just allowing that GTO to be sitting on that one corner of the grille, I think that could work really well. But there are other things in here which I think are quite interesting. I mean, one of the bits I really like is the reflection of the texture in the bumper, which is obviously the reflection of the fence that's in front of it. So you've got all this kind of netting, and when you come in this close, that's just really abstract. It feels textured without really having any idea what it is, which I certainly quite like as well. Or you can come out here, you know, and depending on where you decide to place it, there are all these different textures, and you know, whether you decided you just wanted to come in on the lights, or, you know, like I say, reflections in the bumper. But I think so it's that kind of mix there, Robert. I think really it's a case of choosing your story. It's about, I think, you know, we've talked before about this idea of what is it that's really grabbing your attention? What is it you're really wanting to tell? When you know, something's grabbing your attention. Of course, a bright red old GTO, that's grabbing your attention. But what is it you want to say about it? Because you could just as easily make a story about the fact that it's behind a fence, a caged car, or a car that, or is it, you know, is it about the car isn't being allowed out because it's been fenced off, or it's an imprisoned car, or is it that, or is the fence supposed to keep people away from getting too close to the car? It's protective. Is it about the texture of the oldness of the car? Is it about the fact that the GTO? Is it, you know, there's different stories going on there. And I think really, if you can find your story, pick the one, or take several photos, do several stories, but within each photo, decide what, I'm going to do a story about the texture. I'm going to do in the reflection in the bumper. I'm going to do a story about the GTO letters. I'm going to do a story about the headlights. I'm going to do a story about the grille. I'm going to do a story about the fence and the relationship between the fence and the car. And, so do a portfolio of 6 different stories that you can get from the one thing. But each individual photo has to have the story. The problem is when we try and fit 6 stories into one photo, that's when it never really works so well. But lots of potential with this. I can certainly see why you grabbed it. You're cursing yourself for forgetting your SD card, at least being glad that you had your phone with you. So cool. Anyway, I hope that helps. I hope that gives you some thoughts and ideas there to play around with. So thanks for sending that one in, Robert. Okay, where are a couple of people talking about lovely vintage car. Vandana prefers the original photo to the edited version. Robert admits he tends to overcook a little bit and not letting the photo breathe. Of course, I am working on it. Yes, well, I noticed you prefaced your comment with the fact that this was taken back before you started watching the podcast. So you're trying to let yourself off the hook there. And VG says not to forget the tyre. Yeah, of course, there's textures in the tyre as well. Sandra loves the great vintage car. Vandana says, an imprisoned old soul needs liberation. Absolutely. Oh, that feels like it was sort of from the heart there, Vandana. Christine has come in and said thanks. So now, I wonder if you're watching from slightly earlier in the picture and we won't catch up with what we're talking about for about another hour or so, hour and a half. Okay, we've got an hour and a half into this already. Still got, was that about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, about half a dozen photos to go. I'll push on. We should be finished before 9:30. So just to remind you, if you are enjoying this, if you feel like you would like to support these podcasts, then buymeacoffee.com/Kim Ayres. Right, and if you're watching it on YouTube, make sure you subscribe and hit the little bell for notifications so that you know when new ones come up. Right, okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to move on to Roy. And yes, Roy has black and white. Now, Roy says, hi Kim, this is my entry for the texture challenge taken at Skipton Castle in West Yorkshire. I converted to mono to emphasise the softness of the cobweb versus the hardness of the old wood and the more modern lock. I've included the original image, which was taken with the idea of mono in mind. So he saw this photo, he saw this part, took the image and thought, I'm going to convert this to black and white. So he's got black and white in his mind at the point he takes it. And that's a really good way of thinking. Give yourself a smug point for that, Roy. I think that notion of deciding, of thinking ahead, of thinking to the next level as you're taking the photo, you're already thinking about how you would edit it. And sometimes when I'm doing photo shoots, I'm kind of thinking that as well. I was doing a photo shoot at the weekend. I was chatting to the person. As we were taking photos, I was already thinking in my head how I would be sort of editing it, where the limitations were of what I was able to photograph under the circumstances, how I might be making adjustments. So to be able to start thinking that far ahead is great. So from the original to now, you've cropped in, and that's good. Trick two things here though, I think, to enhance what you're going for. Part of the problem here is the way you've converted it to black and white. I think you've blown a lot of the highlights. Which has actually led to losing some of the texture. Now those are there. If we go back to here, the highlights, they're not too bright here. We can make out a lot more detail on the padlock and in the cobwebs. So part of your let's open this with Photoshop for a moment. Let's just close these ones here so that I'm not slowing the computer down too much. Right, so back here, and your crop is something like this. It's not going to be absolutely exact, but Actually, let's take a quick look. Okay, yeah, that's not bad, not a bad version of it. Yeah, more or less. So that's your crop, and then what you've done is you converted it to black and white. But what you did, well, like I say, was you kind of blew the highlights. Now I think if you can, first of all, channels, what have we got? Red, green, blue. None of those are feeling particularly different because it's in a brown, which is a mix of all the colours. We're not getting much there. If we go to a gradient map, that's giving us more texture to play around with. Now at this point, it's like what you've done is you've taken the curves and you've kind of upped and down and sort of done something like this maybe, and that's giving you deeper shadows, which is more fun. Yeah, that's fairly close. So that's my guess on it. But what's happened though is we've lost some of the highlights. So what I would be, I think, rather than playing with curves, if you can, I'm going to get slightly more subtle with it. So if we come back to here, I'll just duplicate that for a moment. Now, in the editing software, again, if I go to Camera Raw for the moment, we'll just desaturate. Now, obviously, when you desaturate, that's fairly dull. So you're looking to ramp it up a bit. And certainly, if you got contrast, you can start playing with that, but you've got to be careful don't start losing too much in the highlights. I think there are things like the clarity tool is really quite good. The clarity tool, you can see, is really giving us depth, but maybe just pull the highlights down a little bit so we can get a little bit, we're making sure we're not losing too much detail in here. Do you see? If the highlights get blown out, but we can pull that down there. And I think when you've got something like that, we're still very much, you can even up the texture a little bit. There's plenty to play around with that slider as well. That's, you could maybe even add in a little bit of a vignette or something there, which sort of just darkens down, something like that. And then that way we've got the black and white, we've got the contrast between light and dark, so we've got the richness of the textures, but what we haven't done is lost too much detail from the highlights and it's able to keep it there. So I hope that kind of makes sense. The only other thing that I feel with this is that there's kind of too much gap in the middle. We've got this lovely bit of the lock over here and all the cobwebs. This in itself is a kind of a story. That's a photo sort of sitting like that, or maybe sort of, but then we've got stuff over here which is really quite interesting as well. But it's kind of too big. The eye is leaping too far from one side to another. So I'd be tempted to just kind of crop in closer and say, I'm going for the lock and keep it there. If you wanted to get really fancy with your editing, what you could do is basically crop this and move it over a bit. So what we see here, so for example, we've got this plank of wood here, this plank of wood here. What I could do is, if I copy that, paste that, drag it over and essentially replace that there, crop that in to there. Now we've got a slight straight line there, so I would just mask that, turn that to black, and then just kind of do something like this so that it's not quite so obvious where one ends and the other begins. And then if you've got something like that, now you have the texture on the right, you've got the texture on the left, you've got the padlock in the middle, and you're not feeling like there's this huge gap between one part of the story and the other. And this part on the right is complementing and adding to and helping to frame this section in the middle. Whereas if we go back to the gap kind of just feels too big. So ideas to play around with there, Roy, both in terms of how you're converting it to black and white, what you're doing maybe with texture or clarity sliders instead, but also that idea, if you really want to get a little bit more creative, can we actually pull in and mask and kind of create something which feels really has the texture there. And something like that, almost square crop, worked quite well on Instagram. I think becomes a really interesting image to play with. So thank you for sending that one in, Roy. Great ideas. Right, okay, where are we at? Okay, Megan's got to leave. She found it really helpful, but she says she's now hooked on the podcast. Well, I hope you come back, watch the rest a bit later, and I hope you come back for the future ones. Vandana says, another lock. We love them. Sandra says, love the rusty look of the rock. VG says, yes, there's a great edit with the padlock and the cobwebs. Jackie's enjoying the locks edit. Vandana says it looks more amazing after the edit. And Sandra thinks the crop looks better as well. And Roy says, thanks, very helpful. Excellent, good. I'm glad that's working for you. Right, next up then we have Sophie. And, sorry, yes, there we go, Sophie. Now, Sophie says, hi Kim, this is my entry to the textures level. It's recently taken ground view of dry leaves and fresh fallen flowers. This made me sad and cheerful at the same time. Sad as the flowers fall so quickly, but they are also beautifully pink, cheerful even on the ground. So all is kind of pink and green going on, and it's a big sea of flowers here. Now, I imagine some of you might be kind of seeing where I'm likely to be coming from here if we then go and refer back to the likes of Gary's cacti earlier, or even some of the questions, some of the things we were talking about with, suddenly forgot which other one it was. But essentially what we have here is it's like a pattern. And it's an interesting pattern, and it would make great wallpaper. As a background with other things happening, you know, it sort of feels richly patterned, but there isn't something to grab your eye on. There isn't something to draw your attention to. So the eye doesn't really know where to rest. It's kind of constantly moving around and doesn't kind of latch on to any one thing in particular. So this is another one of these where I think, well, with this, you either stand right back and sort of show the context of where the flowers are sitting, or what you want to do is you want to zoom in closer, and you then need to find something that you're going to latch onto, whether you're wanting to sort of take a leaf as the kind of key thing, which has but that's maybe not interesting enough. There's some other bits of flowers, like there's these sort of yellow bits of flowers within here as well, which are maybe quite interesting, and maybe a little bit like the, like we said with the cacti, that when there's so many, what you kind of want to do is you want to find one, maybe this one with the yellow one, and you latch onto that. That is your key story. That's about as far as this is going to go in. That then becomes your primary one, and then the others act as echoes around it. Now, I don't really see a primary one here. This has obviously been taken with that idea of the sea of flowers. Like I say, it works as a pattern, but maybe doesn't work quite so well as a standalone photo. I think you need to kind of nail in on something as your key subject point, and then allow the rest of it to act as a support. But nicely spotted, and certainly worth getting your camera out for. So thanks for sending that one in, Sophie. Right, okay. Jim says this crop is interesting, and Vandana says, oh, this is an moment for me. Right, is that about the flowers? Right, okay. So let's move on then. So the next, okay, Vandana, you're next up. Right, so Vandana then has gone for another orchid. This is kind of interesting. Vandana says, my contribution to the challenge just took this one, keeping in mind textures, soft but not quite reachable. Any critique is welcome. So, Vandana, is there a theme after your kind of heartfelt and imprisoned soul with Robert's car behind the fence? Now we have an imprisoned orchid behind the plastic coating. This is really interesting, and certainly I think smug points for you here, Vandana. There's definitely something. There's a nice kind of play that we've got the flower, and there's the lovely textures of the orchid, but then we've got this other layer in front of it, the plastic coating. And you know, as you say, is it imprisoned or being protected? And I think that's it does add quite an interesting sense of texture above texture. So I like that. The only bit that sort of, well, the bit that kind of grabs my attention here is I think that where the eye wants to get drawn to is the centre of the orchid. This is where there's a lot of detail going on, and so because of all the detail, it becomes like the main bit. That's the bit where the eye wants to go to, except for the fact that it's mostly lost in shadow, and that up here we've got the bright edges, you know, the bright, that's where the light is catching. And because the light is catching up here and little bits down here, but basically it's around this where the eye is getting drawn because of the brightness of the image. But what the eye wants to do is really be drawn down here. So I think now you can mess around in editing to an extent, but it's going to be fairly limited in what we can do. So just to reiterate, if I just turn this to a pencil tool for the moment and say it's this area here that is where we're really wanting to have the attention drawn to. But what's grabbing our attention is this. And that's not the key part of the photo. The key part of the photo is the bit to the left of it. And to use a little, well, anyway, so what I would say with that is in an ideal situation, if you're editing it, you would want to brighten that part up. So, I mean, even just very simply, if I take a curves here and it's going to be a bit tricky. This isn't going to be ideal, but if I then take that and paint bucket that in, so we do that, and then I'm just going to take the brush tool and paint in the lower layer. You see, that now brings much more attention to this area. You see, it just kind of draws the eye in. And also, by contrast, if I was to take the curves and bring them down a little bit, and again, let's just mask, and then just essentially allow that to sort of darken down a touch, something like that. I mean, it's not perfectly balanced, but all I'm doing is trying to sort of give you a sense of what's going on. Maybe if we take the levels, draw that up a little bit more like that. And what we can see now is there's a bit more in the way of attention grabbing from this part of the orchid. So now, I think you play around, you're mostly shooting on the phone, so and you're going to be very limited with what you can edit. If we go back to the original picture, what I would say the way around this is where the light is falling is essentially angle it round a little bit. If your light source is coming from the left, if your window or whatever is coming from the left, if you were to turn this to the left a little bit more, and then maybe move your camera around a little bit as well, the light would hit this part, the central part of the orchid. And I really think it's because it's in here where the real detail and the interest and the story is happening. And that's the bit that you want most lit up. So if you can't play it with the editing, and better not, I would say it's always better if you can get as much as you can done in the natural light before you get to the editing, because it gives you more options. But that's the bit that you want to have lit up. So I hope that helps, Vandana. Right, where are we? Yep, so VG picks up on the idea of the picture, the thing being trapped. Jackie says it's got a kind of surrealistic feel. Jim says, well done, Vandana, nicely caught. And VG says, yes, soft. And the sheet looks like a curtain. Cool. Okay. So next up then, what we're going to do is VG. And let's flip over to here. So VG says, took this photo for the this week's challenge, the texture of metal and denim. Took it both in colour and converted it to black and white. And she put both in, and I said, well, obviously pick one. And she decided to go for the colour, which I think was probably the right choice. Several people said they preferred the colour one, except for Roy, who obviously preferred the black and white. I think the colour works well because really in the black and white, certainly the stitching got lost. What I quite like is that you're contrasting here not just textures but colours. You've got the texture of, the hard texture of the brass zip itself, but then you've also got the orange thread that runs through the denim, which nicely echoes that, and that gets lost in a black and white version. The only problem with this, I tend to feel, is it feels quite central and it feels quite narrow. And really, I kind of feel like I want a bit more space over to one side. So again, hopefully if the content aware is going to let me do it, what I kind of really feel I want this to come over a little bit, maybe pull this up a touch, something like that. So we're going a little bit more kind of rule of thirds really. And then if that does what it looks like it is, yep, something like this. No, it's not got it absolutely perfect because the zip would of course run further down into the corner. But I think the balance of it just feels slightly, but that just feels just a bit too kind of, so you're either pulling out or alternatively you are pulling in further, in which case, you're coming up to something like this, which but again, getting in close. But having said that, I think I do quite like the sort of slightly wider, and getting a bit more of the texture of the denim in that we have with that kind of crop. But as it is, I think it's just kind of a bit too central in a narrow thing, and having it slightly off centre and allowing these sort of curves to come round will work a little bit better. But I think I remember you saying something about the problem of sort of flaps coming over and trying to pin it and stuff. But in essence, if you're thinking about composition, that's the way to go. But yeah, nice contrast. This is one of the very few shots which really got in closer, as I was expecting with texture, wanting to try and get that sense of, here we have the brass and the denim. So thanks for sending that one in, VG. And yeah, have a smug point for that, I think. Right, and where are we? So, Jim has said nicely captured bandana. And where are we? Oh, yep. Sandra says nice close up of the zip, and Vandana says zipped up. Cool. Okay, so we're now going to move on to the final image, and then I'll talk a little bit about next week. And all right, Jim says lovely clear image, VG as well. So, last one I want to talk about is Inga's, and this one is called My Entry for the Texture Challenge, a birch trunk in sunshine. And I have to say, I really do like this. This kind of captures everything in a texture photo that I think you can ask for. So you've got this, we've got the bark of the birch tree, which has all the layers and curls off. And we know, and we've got the lichen on it as well. It's not a wet tree, it's a dry tree, but you can kind of feel the, you know what the dryness of that would feel like, that roughness under the skin. Multiple kinds of texture. But what I also love about this is the use of side light. This feels like it sort of contains everything I was talking about last week when I was showing you the stone carving, which is a strong side light, in this case presumably the sun coming from the sun, is really enhancing these shadows here. Give us such a sense of the depth and the curl of the bark, and that sense of texture within it, I think is rather lovely. I also quite like the fact that on the back part as well, there's looks like there's another light source here, whether it's sort of reflecting, there's something maybe the light is bouncing back off and reflecting and starting to highlight in here, sort of filling in some of the shadows. Not sure quite what else is there. Maybe a sort of, if anything, is sort of wanting to maybe zoom in a little bit closer, maybe trying to find something which is a particular focal point. Having said that, I kind of feel the focal point for this is almost this double curl that just sort of comes down through here. That's where the real story is for me. It's this part here where we've got this double curl coming down, and we've got the shadows, we've got the depth, we've got the gap, we've got the texture running through it. But I like the colour as well, that sense of a kind of a low sun coming in and hitting the bark. So definite smug points for you, Inga. I think there's a really lovely sense of texture that you've got that, and some nice, again, lichens, mossy lichens down here as well. In fact, this is another one where you can see, even just we pull down to something like this, that in itself I think becomes quite an interesting photo. There's areas you can practically take almost any point in this and just crop it in, and it becomes, this here becomes a kind of an accentuated part of what I was talking about. Yeah, and I really quite like that as well. I suppose this the theme, kind of running theme with this is when you're trying to do texture, don't be afraid of getting in close. And I sometimes think kind of the closer you can get in, the better. So those are the pictures that I wanted to talk about this evening. And I hope you've all found that rather interesting. Thank you to everybody who put stuff in. Thank you to everybody who's commented as well and given feedback. So next week I haven't fully decided yet on. Well, we will be doing another challenge in 2 weeks. Next week I will set that challenge, but I will also talk about whatever that challenge is set for. But next week what we will also be into, though, is the critique section. So challenges are fun, and we've certainly had a lot of fun. I hope you've learnt a lot tonight. Critique is where you can really get in and get personal. What do you want to know about photography? Critique can be, a couple of things here. You can send me images. Send me your images which you're struggling with, and let me know where your struggle is, and I will do my best to help you. If you consider you have a professional photographer here at your disposal, this is your chance to learn and get past whatever is difficult for you individually. I'm not just doing a generalized course where you can kind of pop in and out, but it's anonymous and it's not really tailored to you. This is an option for you where I can specifically tailor an answer specifically to you and specifically to one of your photos if you want. Make the most of that. There's not that many places on the internet where you can do this, and I'm right here for you. So next week, think about either a photo that you want or a principle that you would like to know more about, or that there's where you're having difficulties. You can ask questions that's as well as stick photos in, but really understand that this is, we've set up Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres to help you really understand photography, and we all have bits which we don't feel we've quite got the grasp of. What's your sticking point? What would you like to know? What would you love to know? What would you feel, yeah, if I could just get a grasp on that, I know my photography would start leaping up a bit. And you're not just limited to next week. This is ongoing. I've no plans on stopping the podcast anytime soon. Although, who knows? I might get knocked over by a bus. You'll never get another chance. Put a little bit of jeopardy in there. Okay, so that's us. Have a think about critique for next week and what you might want to put in for that. And I'll have a think about it. In the meantime, if you found these useful and you would like to support these podcasts, then buymeacoffee.com/Kim Ayres is where you can do it. But also tell your friends, invite people along, because there's other people out there who desperately want to improve their photography as well. And as you know, we have a fantastic community of really helpful, interesting people here. Let's grow this community. So with all that in mind, thank you ever so much to everybody who's come along, and I look forward to seeing you all next week. Take care. Bye-bye.